Okay, folks, I think there are probably going to be a few more folks joining us, but let's go ahead and get started. Just clicking on somebody here. This is the monthly webinar, more or less, of the Fair Districts NC program, which is a program of the League and a coalition of several partners. And we're very glad to have you joining us. We're going to be looking at the road ahead here, and you can see, I think our little slide here pretty much tells the story. Are we going to get more gerrymandering, or are we going to be able to get some kind of redistricting reform? And we are very honored to be joined by two distinguished legislators, Verla Insko and John Hardister, and I'll do a more complete intro for them in a minute. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. We're continuing our look at what's happening in redistricting and what we could possibly get done by having conversations with legislators, and in particular looking ahead to the coming session, which will start in January. We've previously, just to remind you, we've had webinars with Chuck McGrady, who retired from the legislature at the end. I guess officially will retire at the end of the year, and has been a strong supporter of redistricting for quite a while. And then we did a very interesting webinar with Representatives Chaz Beasley, Craig Horn, former legislator Skip Stam, and Senators Terry Van Dyne. We did that before the election, and none of these folks are on the ballot. So that enabled us to talk with them. That will be posted shortly, or maybe just was posted. And today we're, as I say, extremely honored to have with us Representative John Hardister and Representative Verla Insko. And our topic is going to be looking at how we can improve the processing criteria for redistricting that are used in redistricting, and whether we can get that done in time for next year's all-important redrawing. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of what we mean by processing criteria. Then I'll introduce our speakers and we'll have a discussion. And we're going to try to stay out of the weeds, hopefully. You know, if we go too much into this, people would be, probably not totally excited. So processing criteria are all about the how. How do we draw the maps? Not so much the who. We often think of redistricting reform as having being really defined by three key questions: who draws the maps, who approves the maps, and how are they drawn. So processing criteria is really the how part. We think the elections probably pretty much answered the question of who is going to be drawing and approving, and that would be the legislature. And we may be proven wrong. There may be more support for reform, but we'll see how that happens. But of course, the all-important unanswered question is whether or not the redistricting will involve the lottery machine again. For those of us in the room, that was so exciting to see that. But anyway. So process is the steps involved in drawing the maps. And that little diagram over there on the side is just decorative. I have no idea what it is. The timeline is a key part of that. Who does what, when they do it, how they do it, what the roles are for the public, particularly including how many hearings there are, where they are, at what point in the process they have hearings, whether the public is able to submit maps, what, if anything, happens to those maps, whether they can submit public comments, as well as participating in hearings, and how much information is put on the website, if there even is a website. Then transparency is another key part of the process, particularly whether redistricting is under the control of open meetings rules or not, but other aspects of transparency as well. How easy it is to, for example, to watch the proceedings online, what kinds of documents are made public, and so forth. The data that is required and what data is permitted or not permitted, including data to comply with the Voting Rights Act, and the resources that are made available, such as staff and funding and anything else that they would need to do the redistricting. Excuse me. On the criteria side, typically required are compactness, some reasonable level of compactness, and contiguity. In other words, you can't have a district that is in pieces spread across the map. And then compliance with the Voting Rights Act is mandatory. And keeping geographic units whole. Our Constitution requires that counties in particular be kept whole, but it's generally considered good practice to keep cities, neighborhoods, precincts, etc. And a somewhat difficult to define concept of communities of interest which is to say groups of people who are located in a particular geography and share particular concerns or background and so forth, such that they would best be represented by a single person. I'm just admitting a couple bodies here. Okay. And sorry, now I have, okay. Sorry, I was just trying to admit someone. Then on the prohibited side, whether we are going to prohibit partisan objectives, in other words, drawing a map to preserve partisan advantage, and whether or not we will protect incumbents. And then there's some emerging areas, such as whether or not there should be an effort to make the certain districts or more districts competitive or not. And then whether there should be other measures of gerrymandering besides compactness that would be used to determine whether or not the map was reasonably fairly drawn. And for example, using the efficiency gap or some other measures that are out there, or comparing these maps to a large set of simulated maps. And I'm not going to discuss any of these in any very much detail, but we're going to go into, we'll be going more into hearing what our guests have to say. So why aren't you advancing? Sorry, my computer is not advancing. There we go. So, and now I'm very pleased to introduce our guests. We have first Verla Insko, who happens to be my legislator, representing District 56. She's currently completing her 12th term in the legislature. She's retired from a career in health program administration, and she previously served as Democratic whip. We also have with us John Hardister, representing District 59 in Guilford, and he was reelected, and congratulations, John, for being reelected by his caucus to serve as majority whip in the House, and he's completing his 4th term, and his professional background is in the area of marketing. So they are both supporters of redistricting reform, so have been very involved in supporting bills. We have with us Judge Tom Ross, who was very instrumental in his group, North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform, and I believe we have Mary Wills-Bodie as well on the call. They have been supporting a particular reform, but many groups have been supporting various reforms that were introduced in the previous session, the one that is officially about to end. But we're very glad to have 2 supporters in the legislature to join us tonight. So, so these are kinds of the questions in terms of the criteria. I'm going to go through them, and we'll give each one of them a chance of which ones do they see as the most important, and then which ones do they think would face the highest barriers to adoption. So let me just flip back to the criteria slide here. There we go. So I don't know, Verla, John, who wants to go first?
I'm happy to plunge in.
Go for it.
Regarding the criteria and which one's most critical, I think that I would say the voting rights compliance, probably. That's probably Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still important. Still offers important protections about fairness, and I think one of the important things is proportionality. That's not here, but whether or not the results sort of are proportional to the population split. So especially for the minority populations, for Black communities, are the seats that they won proportional to the proportion of their in the general population. Do you want me to do more than that?
As you wish. If there others you want to call attention to, that would be fine. Sure.
I think keeping geographic units whole will probably be the hardest to do, and that's also it's really important. We have in Orange County some precincts that are actually split, and that's really difficult. So I hope that we'll keep the geographic units whole, as neighborhoods and cities as much as we can. And I think that I'm not sure whether that I identify that as difficult because it didn't happen this time, and so I assume that there's some reasons for that, and that we may have difficulty with that again this time.
Well, sometimes you have to split them here and there to get the even population, but that's just a technical requirement. It doesn't. The 2011 map, I believe, that was later found unconstitutional, split more than 400 precincts, which may be a record out of the 2,700 or so that there are. Well, John, what's your feeling on this? What do you think is what would you see as the most important ones here?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's good to see everybody, even though it's on a computer screen. I think that partisan objectives, making sure that we don't use partisan data in the process is critical. That's something that both parties have done in the past. I think that's particularly problematic. In the latest iteration of redistricting, the courts actually prohibited us from using partisan data, which I thought was certainly a step in the right direction. Also, incumbency protection. I think even though the courts last year allowed us to consider incumbency, I think that was because this was a mid-decade in between census redraw. But after the census is done, constitutionally, when we have to redraw these districts, I don't think we should consider incumbency protection. Also, I think it's really important to draw some attention to communities of interest. I'll give you an example. In Guilford County, the congressional districts literally split A&T University's campus in half. The 6th district had one half of campus, the 13th district had the other half. I don't think that was done on purpose. It was inadvertent, but certainly that's kind of an odd situation, and that's the kind of thing that we should try to avoid.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I have heard people say that they didn't realize they were splitting it, but they also managed to split Asheville, the university in Asheville, and I have heard, although I've not seen it on the map, that they also split UNC Pembroke. So if that, they definitely split Asheville State. So, but yeah, I mean, those sound really good. So actually, the second question is, which of them do you think would be most difficult? I mean, certainly the partisan objectives and incumbent protection, but you may have those in both categories, but what do you see as the most difficult ones to achieve?
Yeah, so I think the most difficult will be partisan objectives, because no party, it's human nature, no party wants to give up their authority. The Democrats did it for a number of years, Republicans have done it. I think that's the hardest thing, because you have to give that up. If you want to draw districts that are done in a way that's the most apolitical possible, by definition, you can't consider partisan data, and that includes results from an election. It includes voter registration, things like that. You shouldn't be able to go back and look at the last election, and you shouldn't look at voter registration and the trend lines that relate to voter registration. So I think that would probably be the hardest thing to give up. But we did that in the last go round. I will make a side note to that. When you draw these districts, even if you don't look at the data, just looking at a map, you can kind of tell, which areas lean conservative, which are, Republican. If you look at a county like Guilford, it's blue, but there's some outlying red areas in the county. And we know that Orange County is blue. And then we know that places like Randolph County are red, but you can't avoid that. But you can avoid looking at the hard data, and that's something that should not be part of the process.
Yeah, I was in the room during the redraws that were done in 2019, and that was really, I wouldn't say it's a brilliant insight, but it was certainly something that struck me watching, in particular, a group of very experienced senators and some former senators sitting around the computer, they were, without saying who they were, you probably know, but they were very experienced people who have been in this business for a long time, one of them more than a generation. so they don't need to seize data, like you say. They know the data for their county, and they were redrawing their county.
I
Sure,
think the partisan objectives will be the hardest to give up. And I think people will not give them up. I think that the issue is whether or not we can have an outcome that shows that it didn't drive the system. Because I assume people are going home at night and looking at the data on their own laptops or something, and I think that's I just don't know how you can prevent that from happening, and then bringing that information back. So I think but I think the proof will be in the outcome, whether or not there's any kind of clear gerrymandering for partisan objectives.
and that's something. Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. That's okay.
No, go ahead.
I do think that I agree that this last go around with a lot of participation and observation and public input was a model that I hope we can continue to follow. I think that gives the public more confidence. And again, I think that in the proof will be in whether or not the districts are divided so that it roughly is proportional to the number of Democrats and the number of Republicans in the state, and how that voting pattern has happened. So we have ways of providing evidence. I don't think you can prove it, but I think we can provide evidence that it's a fair redistricting. I do think that the process, I don't know whether we're in process yet or not, but the process
coming up.
Beg your pardon?
It's coming up.
Oh, good. Okay. Let's see what else is here on criteria.
Well, since you mentioned the wanting to see how the map performs, and that of course naturally requires using election data, but what is in effect emerging is that the consultants kind of out there in the world at large, sort of public interest consultants, are running these numbers as soon as the maps come out. That's been a change in the technology. Or of course, there's the more formal comparison to simulated maps that permits one to say whether the map is an outlier. And so there are new methodologies and new technologies that are changing how that can be done without necessarily having the map makers get involved.
I would just this is public, everybody agrees with this, I think, but the more sophisticated our computer programs are, the more we have to monitor ourselves and put in place an open process. I think probably 2001 was the first year that computers were used. And I remember Brad Miller's district that ran from Greensboro up north and meandered around was a clear gerrymandering. Before that, it was really just using the maps and a pencil and paper, and so gerrymandering went on, but it wasn't nearly as sophisticated or as hard to I think expose as it has been since then. So Republicans do have the majority in both chambers still, and so they will probably bring well, this is process again. I'm getting into process, but they'll probably bring the process that will be followed. And I think Representative Hardister, you served on the redistricting committee before, I think, have you? I've not served on that committee, but I'm happy to hear that you're really interested in following this process that was used more recently. I think that would help the public have confidence in the election. I think that's really important.
Right. And before we move on past criteria, just to reiterate, that the process that was used last year, I thought was a step in the right direction. Might not have been perfect, but the drawing of the maps occurred in public, in committee. General Assembly staff was conducting it. it was streamed and archived, and public input was allowed. And it was an interesting situation. I think Jennifer, you mentioned this before, but some of the base maps for I think they called them like clusters, like a county or a cluster of districts. They actually took them out of a lottery machine. They look like ping pong balls, if you will, and the air is making them jump around, and then somebody reach in and grab one out. And I thought that was an interesting process. It was certainly more transparent, but I'm not saying that's a perfect process, but that's certainly something that we can learn from. And there are different ways to do this. I was looking at the chat just now, and people are asking about an independent commission. That's a possibility. Some states have done that. Some folks might say we should codify and improve upon the way it was done last time, but the way to get there is having conversations like this and, try to generate support in the public.
Yes, and I see a comment that just came in about public input, even though the public was able to observe that public input was limited. But so I think that if we can make the public input more public, more broadly available for everyone to look at, and that would be helpful. And I think we have a very well-informed public here in North Carolina about redistricting. That's probably true in every state. But I think that's having public input into the process and reactions to how things are going on, especially if there's consensus across both parties, that would be really helpful.
I agree with that.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, we are, in fact, this discussion is intended to perhaps quite transparently, but the idea that perhaps a process and criteria bill could move, even if a commission bill would not. Our policy certainly strongly favors having an independent commission, but we're less optimistic that that's going to happen in the coming next couple of months before we start the redistricting. Well, let's move on to the process, since if I can get my computer to advance.
Since we've been talking about it anyway.
Yep, there we go, process. The steps involved in drawing the maps and the timeline and so forth, and the roles for the public, which you've been talking about already. Again, from someone who was in the room, it was clearly, I mean, there's really no question this was the most transparent process for drawing the maps, in terms of a statewide maps. I can't speak for all the county redrawings and so forth, but that North Carolina has seen. So that was a real step forward, and I think that the leadership has expressed that they feel proud of that, and they're right to feel proud of that. That is encouraging them to try something similar. I would hope that they would codify that in a bill, and actually adopt something rather than just following it, because of the court order, they had to move quickly. But since there is a little bit more time, and put together a good process and criteria bill that would really make some of this stuff clear.
So I guess I have a question, and that is, I don't know that there's actually a requirement for a processing bill statutorily, and I don't think there's not always been a processing bill.
No, there isn't a requirement to my knowledge, but nonetheless, having something that would really pin it down as to what the process is, because they were redrawing, of course, this most recent time under court supervision or court oversight, and that the court was going to have to do something with the maps, or could potentially have said, no, that's not good enough. The time was very short, so there wasn't a lot of opportunity to do that. But nonetheless, if there were something in writing and it really mandated it, that would be somewhat more enforceable than otherwise.
Well, I think that, we open for bills. We go into business on January the 27th. I think anyone could file a process bill. It would be eligible to be filed. Which might be interesting as an exercise, as to get that discussion started. So I see a lot of questions about the independent commission, and I'm sure that there will be an independent commission bill from the Democratic side. I'm not. There may be one from the Republican side. It would be great if there was, and we could sort of try to come at it from that direction. I don't think that. I doubt that that bill would pass this year, but I don't, but it would be good to have a committee debate on it.
Yeah, there were some introduced last time. John, sorry, go ahead.
No, I apologize. Yeah, I agree with Verla. I think there might be a benefit to having a process bill filed, something that would more or less codify the process that was used last year. And then also, I think we should consider the independent commission still. I think that would probably be the best way to do it. The question is, do we have the votes to get it done? On my side of the aisle, Representative McGrady was a major champion of redistricting reform. He was a lead sponsor on several bills. Of course, he's retired now, but we do have, in addition to myself, Sarah Stevens, who is the Speaker Pro Tem. She's in a leadership position. I believe Representative John Faircloth, who's a senior chair of the Appropriations Committee, is a supporter as well. So we do have some support on our side of the aisle. And I think we should continue to advocate for the independent commission, but it probably would be practical and beneficial for us to have, some form of a codification of the process that was used last time around. And I'll say as a side note that my district, as a result of the redraw last year, became extremely competitive. I had a district before that was a fairly safe Republican seat, and then it became very competitive, which is fine with me because I like competition. I think it's healthy for our democracy. And I was very fortunate that I was able to prevail. But I think at the end of the day, when we look at this, I don't know if there's a perfect way. When you're dealing with government, I don't know if there's a perfect way to do it, but there is a better way. And I think our goal has to be able to find the best way to do it. And secondary, what can we actually get done?
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't want to have the perfect be the enemy of the good enough. And that's and so we certainly would strongly favor having an independent commission. The league has advocated that. That is our official position, and we've advocated it around the country and been involved in several of the reforms that have included either an independent commission that draws and approves, or an advisory commission that draws for the legislature's consideration. And the reform just adopted in Virginia, the reform in Utah, Colorado, and in all of those cases, there was legislative action involved, even though there were citizen referenda, which we don't have, of course. Yeah, I mean, the bills that were introduced for independent commissions did include as well quite a bit of detail on the process. So it is definitely something that is, and most of the bills around the country do. So that there is definitely I would think the possibility to do a process and criteria bill, if that was all you could get, all we can get, I should say. But yeah, go ahead.
Jennifer, I agree with you on that. And just one other thing I want to throw out there. There are some folks on my side of the aisle who I think may be reluctant to statutorily enact an independent commission or some other reform because they're concerned if we lose a majority, the other side gets in, they'll repeal it. The solution to that would be to have a discussion about a constitutional amendment. That way, no matter who's in the majority, it's the law. You can't really, repeal it without going through a very intricate process. I think that's something we could consider. I think there was a bill, the constitutional amendment filed last session, but just make note that some folks on my side may be worried that, well, we could change it statutorily, but that could be repealed if the other side takes the majority. But a constitutional amendment kind of protects everybody.
And I would say that there's really broad support for a nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan commission, or a bipartisan commission too, in the Democratic caucus. I don't know anyone that currently elected that's opposed to that, but of course it would be a possibility. And so I think a constitutional amendment that a lot of people would consider that. I think if Democrats did get the majority and tried to repeal it, that there'd be a huge public pushback, and we would be in danger in the next election. So I think that wouldn't be a smart move. I hope we'd be smarter than that. So I'd just like to also point out that there's some comments in the chat box about public input being taken before the process begins. And another one I saw that was really helpful was that even in the last process, even though it was much more open, is that there was a huge distance between the process, the people who were actually doing the work, and the public. And there was really no ability for the public to hear anything that was really going on. And so I don't know whether there'd be a way to make some of the, whether it would even be helpful to make the comments, I imagine people are talking at the same time, but being able to make the discussion more available to the public would be helpful.
Well, some states have, you know, for example, made the whole process subject to the open meetings rules, both with regard to the meetings themselves and most documents, generally speaking, not work product, internal work product documents, but you know, which is sort of standard. But as I understand it, in terms of a constitutional amendment, in order to do an advisory commission that draws the maps but does not have the final approval, still the legislature would have to approve them. You do not need an amendment, but for an independent commission that both draws and approves, it would have to, I think there would have to be an amendment because the Constitution says that the legislature draws the maps. One could certainly come up with a procedure that was short of that, of a full amendment that you know, that would limit that rule, and some states have done that. But nonetheless, yes, that if to go to an independent commission, I think it would have to be an amendment, and also, I mean, we could do something now. And then do something later when there might be, I think, more bipartisan support for a stronger reform. But that's just sort of my guess, not with a lot less expertise than you guys have. But do you think they would accept open meeting rules and you know, really opening things up?
I think it's possible. I think a lot of folks on my side of the aisle felt fairly confident and comfortable with the process that was used last time. I think that's something we can build on. I think transparency is great. I think that would go well within my caucus, but you know, we won't know for sure until we actually, you know, start the legislative process next year. But yeah, I think this conversation is great, and this is the kind of conversation we need to be having with basically citizens. And the more people who contact members of the General Assembly, the better, you know, it's going to be. And let me throw this out there as well. I meant to say this before. I think a lot of people, again, on my side of the aisle, are concerned about the litigation. You know, litigation has caused a lot of uncertainty, and I think that has increased the impetus for some people to say, you know what, maybe we should, you know, fix this. Maybe we should do something. Like an insurance policy, if you will, because one day the shoe could be on the other foot. So, you know, if I've tried to tell people on my side of the aisle that, you know, Republicans defeated Democrats in the districts that Democrats had created back in 2010, and that could happen to us too, at a given time. So again, aside from the, you know, the basic virtues of doing the right thing, this is something that affects people on both sides of the political aisle.
Right.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, the demography of the state, you know, is shifting. So that definitely, you know, could be a consideration, you know, over time for sure. What do you think about hearings? I mean, there were, I think, I mean, the list that I saw for 2011 showed that they had conducted hearings in, I think, 60 locations, which is a lot of hearings. Although I don't know how many, if any of those were broadcast or, you know, versus in person, or who exactly, you know, but there were a lot of hearings held.
Well, I would like to have hearings across the state, and I'd like to have them public across the state. And you could do that with Zoom now. You could just have, so that everybody across the state could see every public hearing and build support for that way as you move across. I think the public hearings were less effective when they were just done, and the people that heard them were the people on the committee moving through. So I think they'd be more effective this year, and I hope that'll happen. We do. There's a question about getting public input before the process begins. I think would be helpful. I don't think that there's anything holding that up. I think people could begin to give public input if they had it. I mean, the committee will be appointed, I assume, on January the 13th. And so I think public input, we could also do it more formally, having more public input.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of talk about having members of the public submit maps. I have to confess, I think that's a good exercise, and certainly people can go ahead and do that, and there's no reason they shouldn't. There's a lot more mapping technology out there that's accessible to the public, but I frankly, I'm not sure that has a whole lot of influence as opposed to commenting on the maps that have been submitted, or as they're being developed, and that that is certainly something that we think should be available to people. And one of the challenges is that there were so many comments of how do you actually incorporate them and who reads them and are they responded to. And some states require that every comment be responded to, and that requires obviously staff support to be able to get that to happen. There are literally thousands of comments that can come in. So that I think we've covered. Of course, the timeline, as far as I know, the only more or less fixed deadline is you have to have them done in time for candidates to file at the end of the year. But beyond that, but it's helpful for people to know kind of what's going to be happening rather than suddenly having to dash into Raleigh because they've called a hearing without any warning. I do have one kind of question. I'm not sure you guys can refuse to answer it, but we've been talking about across the aisle and the possibility for cooperation, which is very encouraging. But what about cooperation between the two sides of the two different chambers? In the past, some things have passed in the House and have not been taken up in the Senate. I'm going back, years here.
So in the last decade, Jennifer, that's a good question. The House passed a redistricting reform bill, I believe in 2011. That was right after Republicans took the majority and Tom Tillis was Speaker. The Senate didn't take it up. So in the past decade, we have seen movement, at least in one chamber. I feel reasonably confident that there's a chance we could advance something in the House just based on the conversations I've had with people. But I can't speak for the Senate, obviously. I don't know where they are, but I think just getting something through the House would be a major victory if we were to get something to the floor, something substantial, and pass it. I think there'd be a lot of support for it across the state, and that certainly would put some pressure, if you will, on the Senate to at least consider it. And we can't control what the Senate does. Verla knows that we voted on quite a few bills that that passed the House on a unanimous vote or one vote and never got taken up in the Senate. But we can't control that. We can just control what we do and try to pass good legislation and then try to persuade the Senate to take action.
I think having a bipartisan bill passed in the House would put a lot of pressure. It would be a historic step, first of all. It would be a huge contribution. And I think that we'd get that we could use that process of getting that bill passed to help educate the public further. And so I think there's a lot of advantages to doing that. And it would put pressure on the Senate and also some cover for people in the Senate that do support it, for Republicans and Democrats, both that do support it, for them to be more public about it. So building support in the public for across all the districts would be helpful. We need to do that.
Yeah, we are certainly reaching out to do that. We have spoken all over the state, but I think we were maybe a little bit premature. People were not as interested. We never were able to crack I don't think anyone has been able to crack the way to get people really into the room. But I think that now that it's really upon us that there will be a lot more public interest in it, and certainly people from across the state have to come in, because the legislators obviously are most responsive, and that's fine to their people from their own district.
Well, actually, it would be a step to even have a bill debated in committee in the House, a bipartisan non-redistricting commission, and that would be a mark. So if it could get to the floor and have a good floor debate, that would even be better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if they could bring a commission to the floor, although the legislature, you may well be aware of this, but I'm sure some of our other people on the call are not. The legislature actually approved an independent commission a couple of years ago, and it was for the redrawing of the Asheville Town Council, and that was a Republican-initiated bill. Be wanting them to redraw the council, and the council had refused, and so they actually gave them the option of either creating an independent commission, spelled out in the bill how they would sort of do that, or accepting the map that was also included in the bill that was put together by the legislature. And I was disappointed the council turned that option down, and they ended up with the districts drawn by the legislature. But it actually has still passed the legislature.
Well, that could also be an interesting bill, is to authorize counties and cities to have independent commissions.
Yeah, we are actually undertaking a county redistricting project right now, and we're putting together a website, on the county systems and so forth and so on all the aspects of that. So we very much, it's quite interesting. It's kind of complicated out there, but for sure, I think having more transparency at the county level would, and municipal level, school boards maybe not. School boards seem like a really dangerous area. We're staying away from that.
And I don't think we would want to require that. I think to make it an option would be the way to get the bill passed. That Dillon's law about how independent the local government is really, we haven't settled that yet, but there's some good reasons to leave local governments alone as much as we can.
Yeah, I would agree. Although I was just talking with our colleagues in Scotland County, and there was a piece of legislation, I believe it was 73, that redefined their commission for good reason, actually, to ensure more representation for the largest city in Scotland, at Laurenburg. But it was done by the legislature. So it definitely does happen. And there are other counties, Forsyth, for example, that's been redrawn by the legislature. So it's a very, very interesting process, but we hope that people may get involved in that because it's their county and they really know their county. And they will be, of course, be redrawn. Well, some of them will be redrawn. The ones that are not all at large will be drawn. So that's really very interesting. Tyler, when I'm presenting, I can't see the chat, and Verla has been very kindly kind of monitoring things. But are there other questions in there that we should take up?
Well, there's one comment about the maps that the redistricting committee will pass a bill in 2021 to have new districts in 2022. So the next election will be, the maps will be been put in place for 10 years unless we have court cases. And that is something that I would add, that I think that is the avenue that the Democratic Party would go, probably would be to, if we had an objection to the process, would be to go through the courts. And I agree that that takes a long time.
Yeah, it costs a lot of money. I believe that in analysis it costs millions of dollars in terms of these court cases. John, did you, or Tyler?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The litigation cost us a lot of money. Taxpayers a lot of money. The plaintiffs in the lawsuit have to spend a lot of money on it. I had 3 districts within a decade. Usually your district only changes once every decade, but mine changed 3 times because of litigation, which is why I think some people in the Republican Party might be thinking, okay, maybe we should do something to try to make the process better, to reduce the chances that we'll get tied up in litigation. I mean, the courts are there to provide checks and balances. That's what they're there for. And they had an order last year to redraw certain districts, and we did, and we complied as best we could, and the court accepted it. But how long do we keep going down that road before we do something different?
Yeah, I think that, it seems the technology and the data that's out there on everyone has made it so much worse that what used to be pretty much an incumbent protection process has become, you know, really, really cutthroat. So we would certainly love to see some kind of real progress. I'm very encouraged that both of you guys think that it may be possible. Tyler, are there any other questions out there that we can?
Yeah, we do have a few questions that have been answered. Catherine wanted to know how realistic it is that we will see a change in the process, seeing as though, you know, we're so close to the redrawing, which will happen, you know, next year.
Well, I think that we would be making progress if we had a bipartisan bill and it got a really good debate in committee, and it would be even better if it got debate on the floor. I do think that it probably needs to. I would guess that for both sides that they would want a fuller debate than what we could do in the long session. But I think that would be a good way to start. And I think there's a possibility we could get a bill that would pass, but it's more likely it would get a good debate and get the public more engaged.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't like to prognosticate things like this. I think it's possible, very much in the realm of possibility, that the House could pass something. I'm not sure about the Senate. I think there's a fairly good possibility we could at least have debate in committee. And, you know, it could be a situation where maybe it doesn't happen this session, but we have productive conversations that lead to something happening maybe next year or a following session. But when you believe in something, you have to be dedicated to it, and you have to continue trying and you know, not be deterred. Because I think anytime you're having a conversation, if you get a bill heard in committee, you're drawing attention to it, and that's a step in the right direction. So I would say that, and I would say that, you know, probably what we should do is, you know, Verla and I and others can get together and we can, you know, talk about, you know, a few different options on how to approach this. And I think a few different bills will be filed, and then, you know, we can coalesce around, you know, one or more of those bills. And then what you do is you try to get them heard in committee, because the speaker will likely refer those bills to committees. And we actually did have, I think, a bit of a hearing on a bill last time, Verla, if I'm not mistaken, but we didn't actually vote on it. I think the Elections Committee had kind of a hearing, but for discussion, but there was no vote on it. So yeah, I'm reluctant to put odds on it, but I'm always an optimist. I think you know, you have to be optimistic about it and do the best you can.
I do think that there's growing support across the state for that on both sides of the aisle, and that's what it takes. So, and elections do make a difference. I saw that comment that let's just make that an election issue, and I think it was to some extent in this last election, and I think it will be in future elections.
Hey, I just saw a comment on here, Jennifer, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Comment about 4 political parties in North Carolina: Republicans, Democrats, Libertarian, and Green. And I think there's a 5th actually, Constitution.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. And this is why public comment is important. I think the thought process behind, you know, Republicans and Democrats is because those are the 2 largest parties that are in control of the General Assembly. But then again, I think there's merit to the concept that we do have 5 political parties here. So how do you provide them with representation? And that just makes the point that public input is critical.
In a commission design, what is in principle what happens, because the commission represents the voters, and that you would have sort of designated positions for the 2 major parties, but then there really should be additional members of the commission who are not members of either of those parties, but who could potentially be members of one of the other parties. The Libertarian Party in particular has been really strong supporter of redistricting reform, and there were, I think, the first organization to join our coalition, and have been they've been long-standing position of their party is to support a commission and to support reform. So yeah, I mean, these parties are important, and you know, so, but there does have to be a role for people who are not members of either party, including, of course, unaffiliated voters who are greater in number than the Democrats, and may, in some counties, I'm sorry, greater number than the Republicans, and in some counties also outnumber the Democrats. So there is, you know, that's very important to have people who are not from the two major parties.
I want to make a comment that's a little off the subject, and that is that some of the things that we're experiencing really have a historical basis. So for North Carolina, because of our history, Democrats had control from 1894 to 1994, 100 years. And so there was so the redistricting was all done to protect incumbents. And that's where that incumbent protection really took hold. And then Republicans won the House in 94, and then in 2010 in both chambers. And so really this is a rather a new discussion, even though because the parties have been realigning, and a lot of Democrats moved over to the Republican Party. I don't think the Republican Party currently is actually the historic Republican Party. It's changed, and I guess the Democratic Party's changed too as a result of that. But
I'm very encouraged by the example of Virginia, which adopted a reform with bipartisan support and actually had substantial support from the Republican side as well as the Democratic side, and that was put before the voters and was ratified. So that is the first real commission in the South, and that was very encouraging.
We have some more questions. Ellen wanted to know about the fact that both the House and Senate leadership have been very opposed to redistricting. What can the public do to overcome that? Seems as though the majority of the public wants something to change, and also what, in your capacities as legislators, what can you all do? I know Representative Hardister, you are the majority whip.
Yeah, so that is a great question. As far as advancing legislation, there are really two gatekeepers in each chamber, in the House and the Senate. On the House side, you have the Speaker of the House, who decides what goes to the floor, which bill goes to committee. The Speaker can also practically control which bills are actually heard in committee, and then of course the Speaker sets the schedule. The second gatekeeper is the caucus. Pretty often we'll have bills that are discussed, and whether or not we take them to the floor sometimes is a vote of the caucus. We'll get together. For instance, we currently have 65 Republican. So we'll get together in a caucus, we'll talk, and sometimes we'll vote and, see if we have enough support in the caucus to advance legislation. Being the majority whip doesn't really give me any more authority than a rank and file member, because to get a bill heard, I still have to convince the Speaker, I still have to convince the caucus. And we do have another supporter of redistricting reform. Sarah Stevens, again, is the Speaker pro tem. So it's really a matter of changing hearts and minds and having people in the public reach out to their legislators and talking to them and, convincing them to let this be heard and, allow it to go through the process.
Well, Representative Lewis, who is, of course, will not be in the coming session, he said, as you mentioned, there was that one discussion, and he said that the bills would be taken up, but in fact, that did not happen, because the Rules Committee is also, obviously working under the Speaker and so forth. So, yeah, and the President pro tem. So, yeah, that I think certainly, but having good support within the caucus would definitely be something that would I would think then make a real difference to getting something to come forward.
We have a question from Bob. He wants to know if there's any legal precedent from the North Carolina Supreme Court's prior decisions that will carry over to the new redistricting process and help guide the legislature in 2021?
Well, I
Go
think
ahead,
they
go
all will. I'm trying to think about specifics, but I think that once something's been handed down from the Supreme Court, it's from the state Supreme Court, that it is incorporated in further decisions.
And that's the challenge, because the two court cases that led to the most recent redrawings were Superior Court cases, and the decision was made not to appeal them to the Supreme Court, in part because of time, but also I think precisely not to get a Supreme. I mean, this is my interpretation. I have no inside information. Not to get a Supreme Court ruling and precedent. So they don't have much precedential power, but certainly one can be encouraged that the panel ruled that the North Carolina Constitution does make, would outlaw extreme partisan gerrymandering on the basis that it then is not a free election, which is in the Constitution as a guarantee. But there is no court ruling that, as I understand it, a non-lawyer that has precedence.
Right.
And we also have several questions about the makeup of the commission. So, if there were to be one, how would the members be chosen? Would the legislative leadership choose them? And how would legislators incorporate public input into that process?
Well, there are multiple sample bills around from other states, and that all of those decisions would be debated and incorporated into the bill, and that would take and I think that as we've talked, that there may be more than one bill filed this year, but that those kinds of decisions would be in the commission bill, controlling all of those questions. Like I saw a question like, if the commission drew maps, would they be final? And sometimes in some of the laws, it has to be endorsed by the state too, so the state can also undo it by not voting for it. But in others, it is put into place. So that would be. We all have a lot of work to do. Just getting a bill before House means that's when you all would really have to go to work saying, what do you want the model bill to be? I invite you to do a model bill, and go through that debate process yourself, and seeing there are good points on both sides. Sometimes it's not clear what is the most a democratic way, or the most democracy consistent way of making a decision.
There actually was a bill that a number of, in addition to the NC for RR bill, there was another bill that a lot of the the sort of pro-democracy advocates worked on, that was introduced, and something strange happened to it in the House, which we could discuss with Mr. Hardister, which he had absolutely no role in. I'm not sure. But if he wants to know what happened there, we can tell him. But the bill in the Senate was a good bill, but it was again never taken up. I have done a pretty extensive study of the commissions that are out there, and I can tell you that it's interesting but true that there is no commission where the legislative leadership, the so-called four corners, the top the leaders of each party in each house, where they have no role. They always have some role, at least in possibly throwing people off of a list or naming people. The Virginia bill, actually half of the commission is sitting legislators who are selected by the leadership, and the rest of them, the other half, are selected by the leadership from a list put forward by retired judges. So there's a whole different range of ways that the leadership plays a role, but they always play a role. Like it or not. That's the truth.
That goes back to the point that you probably can't make the process absolutely perfect and completely devoid of politics, but you can make it a lot better than it is now. You know, hypothetically, if you had a situation where, you know, each party would appoint, you know, X number of Republicans and Democrats, then maybe there's a list of unaffiliated voters that would be chosen from, you know, something of that nature. And then, of course, you'd have to have the requirement for public input and the criteria, the parameters that are put into place. I think something like that has efficacy and would function fairly well compared to what we have now.
That would be great, and that kind of process is what you see in the commission after commission. That in California, the leadership has the opportunity to throw people out of the pool, and interestingly, the commissioners said that they've done a couple of trips to North Carolina, and I had the opportunity to travel around the state with them on one of them, and they said that it was very interesting that that this process actually made the commission stronger, because the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership of the two houses sat down together and went over the list and agreed on who they were going to throw out. And so they ended up throwing out, each one threw out the others, and they had, of course, done research on the people who were on the final list. And they threw out the more extreme members. Republicans threw out the more extreme Dems, Dems threw out the more extreme Republicans. And so they ended up with a commission that was probably a better commission, more moderate overall, and able to work together. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have that input.
I see a question in there about the whip's role. So I used to be a whip, and actually the whip's role is probably maybe different in different sessions, but it's actually a support role as much as I never ever felt like I had a whole lot of power to require people to do things. So it's yeah, it is to. On my side of the aisle, it was to really stay in touch with everyone, make sure they were informed about the issues, make sure that they knew the Republican side, the Democratic side, and where we were going. And we do, on our side of the aisle, we do put pressure on our members to vote with the party. And it's usually not very serious pressure. It's not, it's really just a request. Occasionally there's someone who votes with the other side. And do they pay a price? I think they probably do at some point. So that is politics. I don't know what, I think it varies from state to state how powerful a whip is. But here in North Carolina, it's not especially, it's not that powerful.
Yeah, Verla is exactly right. So the role of the whip in the Republican caucus is exactly as Verla described. Really, it's a euphemism for vote counter and attendance.
Yeah.
We spend a lot of our time tracking attendance, you know, making sure that people know when they need to be in session. If there's a vote coming up on something that's a high priority, we track everybody's attendance, and inevitably someone's going to say, well, I'm having shoulder surgery, or my sister's married, I'm not going to be there. So we do a lot of that. And I would say that it's consensus building. If we have a vote on something, say it's a state budget, and there's a few members of my caucus who say they're not voting for it, well, what I'll do is put them in touch with the sponsors of the bill, the chairs of the Appropriations Committee, and they'll try to work that out. So we've never tried to influence people to vote a certain way. In fact, we like to say, vote your conscience first, your constituents second, and the caucus third. But then again, there are times when there's political pressure, and that's just the nature of the system. And I think that happens on both sides. But all that to say that to advance this type of legislation, I think candidly, we probably need to identify people across the state to reach out to Republican members and go talk to them. If as Verla said, if the Democratic caucus is pretty solid behind it, but there are a good number of Republicans who are not, then you kind of have to go talk to them and, have one-on-one conversations and persuade them to consider this. And that's what we'll need to allow this to advance.
And just to piggyback off of that, we do have a question. If it's any good to contact the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader, even if we aren't in their district, since, you know, they do wield so much power? Are they going to care about voters in other districts?
I think.
Well, go ahead, John.
Well, I think for the most part, Verla, I suspect will agree with this, that legislators are going to listen more intently to people who they represent. So I think that's where you have to start. But there's no harm in reaching out to the pro tem of the Senate, the Speaker of the House. You know, I don't see any harm in it. The more people they hear from, it might have an impact. But I think, you know, practically the legislators who you know, represent you are the ones who are more likely to actually listen to you. So I think that's where people should focus.
I agree with that. I do think that the speaker, someone in the speaker's office is aware of those comments that come in, and if there's a huge influx of comments on one issue, I suspect that gets passed along. The speakers and the leadership people are very busy. They've got a lot of staff doing a lot of the work for them. That they've got their time is stretched in many directions. So yeah, I think sticking with your there's certainly nothing wrong with contacting leadership and having a lot of people do that on one issue. The leadership would be aware of it.
And speaking of time, we're actually over time, and I'm very conscious that you guys have been very generous and kind to join us. So I want to be sure that we do respect your time. And so I think, unless Tyler, is there another burning question in the chat?
There are a few more. Ellen wanted to know if the General Assembly ever discussed the redistricting maps that the Supreme Court justices, the retired Supreme Court justices came up with, the maps that the North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform came up with, the group that Judge Ross had convened.
I think it was Common Cause, actually, but Judge Ross was.
Oh, yeah.
So it wasn't discussed. It would have been discussed by committee, election law committee members, probably. It could have, those probably were discussed at the caucus level. Some, there was never any, never any group pulled together at the General Assembly to discuss them.
Okay. And I just wanted to know, following up on some of the other questions, would you all consider looking at commissions or legislation from other places like Virginia, where they have passed a commission? Colorado was mentioned in the chat. You know, could you all look at these as models for something?
I think a lot of us already have. I suspect that I know I've looked at several states' bills. I think a lot of people have who are interested in the issue.
I agree with that.
Well, I think this has been a really encouraging discussion, and I certainly want to thank both of you for joining us. And we're glad to have, doing a series of bipartisan talks, and they've all been, very, very interesting, and I think very, very positive and encouraging that it is possible to get something done and possible to work across the aisle. And I think North Carolina used to have a reputation for doing that. And I think we would all like to see more cooperation between the parties and try to move the state forward on a sensible basis that people can broadly support. So I really do want to thank you very much. Do either of you have any sort of closing remarks that you want to make before we wrap it up?
Well, thank you very much for having us. I think this is a good model, and I hope that you'll continue this. I would add that Democrats and Republicans actually like each other, and we do for most bills. It's that 5 or 6% or 4 or 5% of the bills where we have philosophical differences. But I think that getting to know people on the other side of the aisle is really important. And we've had a big class come in this year, last year, and we have another one this year. So there's still work to do. Thanks. But thanks so much for having us.
And I'll second those comments. Verla's exactly right. Probably 90+% of bills we vote on are bipartisan. There's a lot of collaboration that takes place. And Jennifer, thank you for having us on today. It's always a great discussion. We'll do it again. Hope everybody has a great holiday season.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much. And we are, I hope, recording this and we will post it online and hope to have another conversation after, after you guys convene.
Sounds great.
Great.
Thank
So
you.
thanks so much. We'll wrap it up now. Thanks a lot, guys.